Last week, we started talking about why prayer matters as a spiritual discipline. But not only is prayer about talking to God, He also wants to talk to us. But how does He speak to us? Let's talk about it on 3-Minute Theology. If you missed my last video, it might help make this one make more sense. Last week, we talked about how our experience in prayer changes over time as we mature. We could divide this into 4 stages. And again, this isn't a perfect science. It's really just a way to describe the process people go through. We talked about the first 2 last week. Number 1, talking to God using the words of others. Number 2, talking to God using your own words. Number 3, learning to hear God's voice. And finally, number 4, simply being with God. Like I said last week, I think that our frustrations or lack of interest in prayer might come from never getting to this third place where we hear the voice of God. As we grow in prayer, we usually desire not just to speak to God, but to listen to Him, to hear His voice. And now this raises all sorts of questions about what exactly we mean by God's voice. But I really believe that learning to hear God's voice is one of the most important things a disciple of Jesus will ever do. In John 10:2, Jesus is teaching and is likening Himself to a shepherd and His disciples to sheep. Jesus says that those who are truly His sheep will know His voice and follow it. For Jesus, discipleship to Him is not just about knowing doctrine, though that is important. For Jesus, discipleship to Him was meant to be an interactive and dynamic process. The question then is, how do we hear God's voice? I've done a whole video on 8 ways God speaks, so I'll just remind you of these really quick. 8 ways God speaks. God speaks through creation. God speaks through our conscience, which is the part of us where we determine right from wrong. God speaks through circumstances. God also speaks through signs, wonders, dreams, and visions. God speaks through people. God also speaks through the Bible, and it's important to say that the Bible is the lens we run everything else through to discern whether we've heard God or not. God also speaks through His Son, Jesus. If you want to know what God thinks about you, look at Jesus. Finally, God speaks through our thoughts in what the Bible calls a still small voice. Maybe you've wondered, why doesn't God speak audibly? Honestly, there's no simple answer to that question, but one reason seems to be because God doesn't have to. He has direct access to your mind and imagination. And like Elijah in the cave in 1 Kings 19, most of the time we experience God's voice as a still small voice, not a deafening yell. The longer I spend in ministry, the more I'm convinced that one of the most important things you will ever learn to do is to hear that still small voice of God. And other than the Bible, and maybe through other people, I've found that one of the main ways that God speaks to us day to day is through the still small voice. The best way I've found to learn to hear that voice is to invite God to speak to us, listen for what He says, and write it down. As we do this over time, we begin to learn to discern the voice of God by experience. But there are also a few characteristics of the voice of God that I think will help you discern if you're hearing God's voice or just your own thoughts. And we'll talk about that next week. Until next time.